What if the most explosive royal decision of the decade didn't come from the king, or even the future king, but from the woman the world once knew simply as Kate Middleton? What if the quiet, composed, softly spoken Princess of Wales became the catalyst for dismantling one of Meghan Markle's last remaining ties to the monarchy, and chose this exact moment to do it? And what if the timing wasn't just strategic, but symbolic? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Ask yourself this: what would drive Kate, someone who has spent years avoiding public conflict, to make an announcement so seismic, so disruptive, that it instantly threw Meghan's royal identity into question? And more importantly, why now? Because the truth is, nothing about this moment happened by accident. Not the timing, not the wording, not the impact, and definitely not the fallout. From the outside, it looked like a simple modernization effort, a clean, polished, progressive update to the monarchy structure, a neutral policy change, a subtle shift in the royal rulebook, something that could be filed under bureaucratic reform and forgotten in a week. But inside the palace, it was a bomb wrapped in silk and diplomacy, delivered with Kate's signature calm elegance, but explosive nonetheless. The kind of announcement that shifts power, rewrites relationships, and draws a permanent line between the past and the future. And at the center of it, willingly or not, stood Meghan Markle. Now here's the real twist. The announcement wasn't even about her. Not directly, not by name, not by intent. It was framed as a broad reform, an update that would affect the entire royal structure. But everyone, absolutely everyone, from royal reporters to international broadcasters to Hollywood insiders, understood the subtext immediately. Royal titles would now be tied to royal service. Active role, active duty, active contribution. No exceptions, no shortcuts, no loopholes. And suddenly, Meghan's title, once fiercely defended, once treated as symbolic armor, once seen as untouchable, became something very fragile, something conditional, something that could vanish. But before we dive into the moment Kate stepped forward and announced what the palace had been whispering about for months, we need to understand the pressure behind it, the buildup, the tension that had been simmering for years, the quiet frustration inside the monarchy, the complicated emotions between two women who were never meant to be rivals, and yet somehow became the unwilling symbols of two different futures. Because nothing in the House of Windsor ever happens overnight. Every decision is layered. Every move is calculated. Every announcement is the result of weeks, sometimes months, of internal battles. So let's step back. Let's examine why this moment mattered more than any outsider realized. For years, the monarchy has been under a microscope. Scandals, health crises, public criticism. And through it all, Kate emerged as the most stable, polished, and trusted member of the firm. A unifying force, a steady presence, the embodiment of continuity. And that matters more than most people understand. Because in a monarchy, symbolism is power. Public trust is currency. Stability is strategy. So when Kate speaks, it isn't just a statement. It's a signal, a shift, a recalibration. And her modernization announcement wasn't just about bringing the monarchy into the 21st century. It wasn't just about trimming roles or updating expectations. No, it was about redefining what it means to be royal in the first place. Not by blood, not by marriage, not by tabloid fame, but by service. Ask yourself, who has been serving? Who has been showing up? Who has carried the weight, quietly, consistently, relentlessly, while the world debated drama, podcasts, interviews, and celebrity deals? Kate's announcement wasn't a jab. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't personal, but it was intentional. And that nuance, that razor-thin line between personal impact and impersonal policy, is exactly what makes this moment so fascinating. Because Meghan's position was always complicated. Still royal, but not working royal. Still titled, but not contributing. Still connected, but not present. Still benefiting, but not participating. A contradiction, an unresolved tension. A royal glitch the palace ignored, until Kate decided it was time to fix it. And that leads us to the real question. Did Kate know her announcement would directly impact Meghan? Absolutely. Did she intend for the world to immediately connect the dots? Maybe. Did she foresee the global shockwave that followed? Possibly not, because nobody, not even the palace, fully anticipated how fast and how fiercely the reaction would explode across continents, headlines, and social media platforms. Because the moment Kate spoke those words, active titles for active service, everything shifted. Suddenly, people weren't asking what the policy meant. They were asking, what does this mean for Meghan Markle? And the palace? Silent, measuring reactions, calculating responses, letting the world fill the silence with speculation, something they've mastered over centuries. But the public reaction was just the beginning. The real shock was waiting behind the scenes, thousands of miles away, where Meghan was about to learn, within minutes, that the monarchy she thought she had outrun had just caught up with her. And what happened in those first few minutes? That emotional hit, that disbelief, that sense of being blindsided? That is where the story truly begins. Because the moment Meghan understood the consequences, the moment she realized her title was no longer guaranteed, the moment she grasped that Kate's seemingly neutral announcement had rewritten her royal identity, everything between the two duchesses changed. Silently, irreversibly, and permanently. But here's the thing the public didn't see. The part hidden behind the cameras, the palace walls, and the carefully crafted statements. Kate didn't make this decision alone. In fact, she may not have been the first person to push for it. Because before Kate ever stepped onto that stage, something was discovered inside the palace archives. Something that changed the entire conversation. Something that turned a maybe one day idea into an urgent, we must act now directive. Something that made Meghan's title vulnerable long before Kate ever said a single word. And that discovery? That's where the true shock of this story lies. What if the most explosive royal decision of the decade didn't come from the king, or even the future king, but from the woman the world once knew simply as Kate Middleton? What if the quiet, composed, softly spoken Princess of Wales became the catalyst for dismantling one of Meghan Markle's last remaining ties to the monarchy, and chose this exact moment to do it? And what if the timing wasn't just strategic, but symbolic? Ask yourself this: what would drive Kate, someone who has spent years avoiding public conflict, to make an announcement so seismic, so disruptive, that it instantly threw Meghan's royal identity into question? And more importantly, why now? Because the truth is, nothing about this moment happened by accident. Not the timing, not the wording, not the impact, and definitely not the fallout. From the outside, it looked like a simple modernization effort, a clean, polished, progressive update to the monarchy structure. A neutral policy change, a subtle shift in the royal rulebook, something that could be filed under bureaucratic reform and forgotten in a week. But inside the palace, it was a bomb wrapped in silk and diplomacy, delivered with Kate's signature calm elegance, but explosive nonetheless. The kind of announcement that shifts power, rewrites relationships, and draws a permanent line between the past and the future. And at the center of it, willingly or not, stood Meghan Markle. Now here's the real twist. The announcement wasn't even about her. Not directly, not by name, not by intent. It was framed as a broad reform, an update that would affect the entire royal structure. But everyone, absolutely everyone, from royal reporters to international broadcasters to Hollywood insiders, understood the subtext immediately. Royal titles would now be tied to royal service. Active role, active duty, active contribution, no exceptions, no shortcuts, no loopholes. And suddenly, Meghan's title, once fiercely defended, once treated as symbolic armor, once seen as untouchable, became something very fragile, something conditional, something that could vanish. But before we dive into the moment Kate stepped forward and announced what the palace had been whispering about for months, we need to understand the pressure behind it. The buildup, the tension that had been simmering for years, the quiet frustration inside the monarchy, the complicated emotions between two women who were never meant to be rivals, and yet somehow became the unwilling symbols of two different futures. Because nothing in the House of Windsor ever happens overnight. Every decision is layered. Every move is calculated. Every announcement is the result of weeks, sometimes months, of internal battles. So let's step back. Let's examine why this moment mattered more than any outsider realized. For years, the monarchy has been under a microscope. Scandals, health crises, public criticism. And through it all, Kate emerged as the most stable, polished, and trusted member of the firm. A unifying force, a steady presence, the embodiment of continuity. And that matters more than most people understand. Because in a monarchy, symbolism is power. Public trust is currency. Stability is strategy. So when Kate speaks, it isn't just a statement. It's a signal, a shift, a recalibration. And her modernization announcement wasn't just about bringing the monarchy into the 21st century. It wasn't just about trimming roles or updating expectations. No, it was about redefining what it means to be royal in the first place. Not by blood, not by marriage, not by tabloid fame, but by service. Ask yourself, who has been serving? Who has been showing up? Who has carried the weight? Quietly, consistently, relentlessly. While the world debated drama, podcasts, interviews, and celebrity deals, Kate's announcement wasn't a jab. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't personal, but it was intentional. And that nuance, that razor-thin line between personal impact and impersonal policy, is exactly what makes this moment so fascinating. Because Meghan's position was always complicated. Still royal, but not working royal. Still titled, but not contributing. Still connected, but not present. Still benefiting, but not participating. A contradiction, an unresolved tension, a royal glitch the palace ignored, until Kate decided it was time to fix it. And that leads us to the real question. Did Kate know her announcement would directly impact Meghan? Absolutely. Did she intend for the world to immediately connect the dots? Maybe. Did she foresee the global shockwave that followed? Possibly not. Because nobody, not even the palace, fully anticipated how fast and how fiercely the reaction would explode across continents, headlines, and social media platforms. Because the moment Kate spoke those words, active titles for active service, everything shifted. Suddenly, people weren't asking what the policy meant. They were asking, what does this mean for Meghan Markle? And the palace? Silent, measuring reactions, calculating responses, letting the world fill the silence with speculation, something they've mastered over centuries. But the public reaction was just the beginning. The real shock was waiting behind the scenes, thousands of miles away, where Meghan was about to learn, within minutes, that the monarchy she thought she had outrun had just caught up with her. And what happened in those first few minutes? That emotional hit, that disbelief, that sense of being blindsided, that is where the story truly begins. Because the moment Meghan understood the consequences, the moment she realized her title was no longer guaranteed, the moment she grasped that Kate's seemingly neutral announcement had rewritten her royal identity, everything between the two duchesses changed. Silently, irreversibly, and permanently. But here's the thing the public didn't see. The part hidden behind the cameras, the palace walls, and the carefully crafted statements. Kate didn't make this decision alone. In fact, she may not have been the first person to push for it. Because before Kate ever stepped onto that stage, something was discovered inside the palace archives. Something that changed the entire conversation. Something that turned a maybe one day idea into an urgent, we must act now directive. Something that made Meghan's title vulnerable long before Kate ever said a single word. And that discovery? That's where the true shock of this story lies. Kate was never supposed to be the one making structural changes to the monarchy. So how did she become the institution's most trusted modernizer? That question alone has sent royal commentators, insiders, and historians scrambling for answers for years. Because when the world first saw Kate Middleton, she was elegant, poised, and smiling, attending ceremonies, waving from balconies, and seemingly content to let the monarchy's machinery hum around her. She was the dutiful wife, the mother, the model of royal decorum. But beneath the polished surface, an entirely different narrative was unfolding, one that would eventually place her at the very center of power, shaping the future of the monarchy in ways few could have predicted. The rise of Kate's influence did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, subtle yet relentless. Every public appearance, every carefully crafted photograph, every interaction with the press and the public was not merely for optics. It was an exercise in building trust, legitimacy, and a reputation for reliability that would outshine even the most senior members of the royal family in certain circles. Where other royals had relied on inherited authority, Kate relied on public approval and consistency. She understood intuitively that influence was not only about position. It was about perception. Her first real power shift began during periods when King Charles's health and public standing were increasingly in question. He faced both personal and institutional challenges, from decades-old controversies to growing scrutiny over the relevance of the monarchy in modern society. Public confidence wavered, and suddenly, the younger generation of royals, particularly William and Kate, were thrust into the spotlight not just as heirs, but as stabilizers. Kate's ability to command attention with calm professionalism became invaluable. In an institution where scandals could erupt with a single misstep, Kate's unwavering composure became a strategic asset. It wasn't just her presence that gave her influence. It was her understanding of timing, of narrative, and of people. Courtiers, once skeptical of her subtle authority, began to rely on her judgment. Advisors found themselves consulting Kate more often than they did senior officials. Even traditionalists had to admit, quietly, reluctantly, that her insight and foresight were remarkably sharp. While Meghan's celebrity aura made headlines, Kate's quiet, methodical approach built trust within the institution itself, cementing her authority in ways that would prove critical during the events leading up to Meghan's title being challenged. But power in the monarchy is never solely about public trust. It's also about positioning. Kate was strategically embedded in a network of influence. William's support was crucial. As the future king, his alignment with Kate's vision gave her proposals legitimacy. When the palace faced tough choices about modernization, about public perception, and about internal governance, Kate's counsel often held the decisive weight. Their partnership was not merely personal, it was institutional. And for Kate, that meant any decision she championed carried both the moral authority of her role and the procedural weight of her husband's support. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, one must recognize the subtle ways in which Kate exercised power. She was deeply attuned to public sentiment. She understood the optics of each move. She could anticipate criticism, preempt scandals, and strategically time announcements. More than that, she recognized the cracks in the monarchy. The unresolved tensions, the ambiguities in rules, the titles and privileges that existed in theory but were inconsistently applied. Her perception of these gaps would later become instrumental in reshaping the rules that affected Meghan directly. Kate's ascent was also powered by contradictions. She projected warmth and accessibility while operating with precision and calculation. She appeared patient and measured, yet when necessary, she could act decisively and strategically. These qualities created both admiration and envy. Admiration from those seeking stability, envy from those who perceived her as quietly outmaneuvering them. Her rise was therefore both organic and controversial, growing in influence not through confrontation, but through consistent demonstration of competence. One of the most critical aspects of Kate's emerging power was her ability to unify. In times of crisis, she became a bridge between public expectations and internal royal operations. While senior royals argued over precedents, privileges, and legacy, Kate was able to translate complex institutional priorities into accessible narratives that the public could trust. Her speeches, engagements, and charitable efforts weren't just gestures. They were carefully calibrated displays of competence and empathy. This alignment of perception and performance amplified her influence immeasurably. All of these elements converged in subtle ways that few outside the inner circle could detect. For years, Kate's influence grew silently, until it reached a tipping point. The point at which she was no longer just a supportive figure, but a decisive actor in policy. When discussions of modernization and reform became urgent, it was Kate who emerged as the natural leader to articulate, frame, and execute the necessary changes. Her rise, however, was not without tension. Traditionalists within the palace, those invested in old hierarchies and protocols, were wary of a younger, non-traditional royal holding this much sway. Whispered conversations questioned her motives, her strategy, and whether she was overstepping her role. But Kate's response was methodical. She did not confront. She did not react publicly. Instead, she strengthened her credibility, leveraged her network, and allowed results to speak louder than speculation. By the time the monarchy faced a crisis surrounding Meghan Markle's role and title, Kate's influence had reached a level where her voice carried not just weight but authority. Even William's role was key. Their collaboration was synergistic. William's position and title, combined with Kate's perception and strategic mind, created a formidable team. It allowed Kate to navigate palace politics with subtlety and precision, ensuring that when she acted, it was supported by both the institution and the public narrative. And because she built her power gradually, she avoided the perception of overt ambition, a delicate balancing act in the unforgiving environment of the British monarchy. But what truly cemented Kate's authority was her foresight. She anticipated challenges, measured reactions, and understood that modernization would require more than policy shifts. It would require public buy-in, careful framing, and impeccable timing. She understood that change, especially in the monarchy, must appear inevitable, natural, and justified. She positioned herself as the calm, rational actor, the stabilizing force capable of leading not just the royal family, but the institution itself into the 21st century. All of this, her strategic positioning, her public perception, her measured decisiveness, laid the groundwork for the critical moment when Meghan's title would come under scrutiny. Without Kate's rise to this level of influence, without the trust she had cultivated both inside the palace and with the public, the announcement that would strip Meghan of her royal privileges might never have been possible. And yet, despite all her planning and careful cultivation of influence, nothing could fully prepare the palace, or Meghan herself, for the exact timing and impact of Kate's announcement. Because even the most calculated power can have consequences beyond what anyone anticipates. The world saw a poised, composed Princess of Wales stepping forward to articulate a modernization plan. They did not see the countless conversations behind the scenes, the silent calculations, the legal reviews, or the moral deliberations that underpinned every word. They did not see how her influence had grown to the point where her decisions could override decades of precedent. They did not see the storm that was about to hit Meghan Markle personally. And so, as Kate's authority solidified, one question loomed large. Could any royal, no matter how famous, as popular, or as entitled, withstand the weight of the Princess of Wales' strategic influence? The answer, as history would soon reveal, was a resounding no. Because when Kate finally spoke, when she stepped into the light to announce the modernization that would redefine royal service and responsibilities, Meghan's title, status, and very identity as a member of the monarchy were suddenly at risk, and the palace would never be the same. Cliffhanger. But Kate didn't propose the biggest change, not at first. It was something she discovered inside the palace records that no one had noticed before, something that would make Meghan's position immediately vulnerable, and the consequences would shock the entire royal family. Before we understand how Meghan lost her title, we need to understand why it was so protected, and why it angered so many inside the palace. That's the question that reverberated quietly through Buckingham Palace long before headlines screamed about modernization or royal reform. Meghan Markle's royal title was never just a name on a program or a line in the press release. It carried weight, symbolism, privilege, and ultimately, power. And every aspect of that weight became a point of tension, a symbol of both hope and controversy. To understand the significance, let's start with the basics. When Meghan married Prince Harry, she did not merely gain a spouse. She gained a title that signified her place within one of the oldest, most scrutinized institutions in the world. Duchess of Sussex. That title was her badge of belonging, her shield, and her passport to influence within a rigid, centuries-old hierarchy. It was a recognition of marriage, lineage, and, theoretically, service to the crown. But there was always a catch. Titles in the monarchy are not merely decorative. They carry responsibilities, obligations, and expectations, whether defined explicitly in letters patent or implied through custom and precedent. The catch, in Meghan's case, was glaringly obvious to some insiders. She was not a working royal in the traditional sense. Unlike her husband, who undertook official engagements, represented the crown at international events, and fulfilled public duties, Meghan's role, after stepping back from senior royal duties in early 2020, became ambiguous. She engaged in charitable work and occasional public appearances, but she was not embedded in the day-to-day obligations of the firm. In essence, her title was a title in name only, symbolic, untethered, and, in the eyes of some, undeserved. This contradiction created tension. Royals have always existed in a delicate balance of tradition, duty, and public perception. Titles are not distributed lightly. They are markers of service, honor, and contribution. The notion that a non-working royal could retain the privileges of an active member of the monarchy sparked debate among senior courtiers, advisors, and even historians. It was a loophole, a gray area, and a potential vulnerability waiting to be exploited or corrected. For Meghan herself, the title was a fortress. It represented status, access, and a connection to a global institution whose influence is unparalleled. To have that fortress threatened was not merely bureaucratic, it was existential. Stripping a title is more than semantics. It changes how the monarchy, the public, and the world perceive you. It redefines your relevance, your legitimacy, and your power. And yet, there was public support for Meghan. Millions admired her celebrity, her activism, and the perceived modernity she brought to a sometimes staid institution. Some felt that she had been unfairly treated by the press, sidelined by tradition, or even betrayed by the very system she had entered. This support added a combustible element to the palace dynamic. Any attempt to alter her status risked public backlash, media firestorms, and cultural outrage, especially in Meghan's native United States. Inside the palace, however, the reaction was far less sentimental. Advisors who had long studied royal precedent saw a contradiction that could no longer be ignored. Here was a person holding a title, yet not performing the duties that justified it. Here was a loophole, a title that existed in theory but not in practice. And as Kate began to examine modernization strategies, she stumbled across this very contradiction. A legal and procedural gap that allowed the palace to argue, unequivocally, that titles should belong only to active members who serve the monarchy consistently and visibly. This discovery was pivotal, because if enforced, it meant Meghan's title was technically invalid under the new interpretation. Technically correct, historically grounded, and procedurally defensible. And once a title is questioned in such a structured way, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to defend, even with public relations campaigns or celebrity influence. It's important to understand why the palace allowed the situation to persist for so long. Titles, while symbolic, are also political tools. Stripping a title can ignite controversy, fracture public opinion, and even affect international relations, particularly when the royal family operates as both a domestic institution and a global brand. In Meghan's case, the palace had delayed enforcement not out of oversight, but out of calculation. They knew any move would be scrutinized, criticized, and analyzed to the last syllable. They knew it could be spun as vindictive, discriminatory, or sensational. And so, for a period, the ambiguity remained, tolerated, unspoken, yet always present in internal discussions. This ambiguity created contradictions on multiple levels. Meghan's title was simultaneously respected and resented, symbolic and contested, privileged and conditional. It became the focal point for debates about fairness, duty, and the evolution of the monarchy. Some argued that the title should stand regardless of active participation, citing precedent where royals retained their status after stepping back from daily duties. Others countered that public legitimacy hinges on visible service, that without active contribution, a title is merely a hollow badge. The public and media added further complexity. Meghan's celebrity status amplified scrutiny. Every appearance, interview, and philanthropic endeavor was measured against expectations that often existed only in theory. Public perception, already divided along ideological and cultural lines, became a powerful force shaping palace decisions. Supporters framed her as a modernizing force, a bridge between monarchy and contemporary values. Critics framed her as opportunistic, entitled, or disconnected from duty. The title, once a neutral designation, became a political flashpoint, a symbol around which narratives of fairness, modernity, and tradition coalesced. Even within the Sussex camp, the title was more than ceremonial, it was strategic. It allowed Meghan access to royal influence, international audiences, and diplomatic circles. It conferred a legitimacy that extended beyond the monarchy into the global arena. It shaped negotiations, appearances, and even contracts. Losing it was not simply a personal slight. It threatened to diminish the reach and impact she had cultivated since joining the royal family. Yet, the palace had long observed a critical truth. Titles, unlike personal wealth or fame, are fragile. They exist within a legal and institutional framework that can be amended, enforced, or rescinded. And the very conditions that allowed Meghan to retain hers were now vulnerable, thanks to Kate's examination of modernization and service criteria. Every precedent, every historical nuance, every letter of the law could be leveraged to justify action that would redefine Meghan's standing overnight. This convergence of symbolism, law, perception, and personality created a perfect storm. It set the stage for a confrontation that was inevitable once Kate, William, and senior advisors determined that modernization could no longer be delayed. And it was precisely this storm that Meghan, immersed in her life across the Atlantic, could not have anticipated. The moment when her symbolic fortress became exposed, when questions of duty and service collided with personal identity, and when the palace would assert authority in a way that could not be ignored. By the time Kate stepped forward publicly, the title that had once represented belonging and legitimacy for Meghan Markle was already on borrowed time. The contradiction between status and service had been resolved internally. The legal and procedural groundwork had been laid. The stage was set for a global audience to witness what was, in essence, the enforcement of centuries-old principle, updated for the 21st century, and tailored in a way that would personally affect the Duchess of Sussex more than anyone anticipated. Cliffhanger. And then Kate found the loophole the palace had ignored for years. A procedural, almost hidden technicality that could make Meghan's title invalid instantly. A discovery so precise, so unavoidable, that it would ignite a firestorm inside the palace and across the world. And once enforced, there would be no turning back. The rule was always there. It just needed someone to enforce it. That sentence echoed in hushed palace corridors before it ever reached the public eye. It sounds simple, almost mundane, but it carried the potential to reshape Meghan Markle's entire royal identity. The so-called loophole wasn't a scandalous secret, nor was it hidden in dusty legal texts forgotten by history. It was embedded in centuries-old precedent, quietly lying dormant, waiting for a royal with both the foresight and authority to act. And that royal, as the story would unfold, was Kate Middleton. To understand the loophole, we need to trace it back to the letters patent. Formal instruments issued by the sovereign defining royal titles, precedents, and rights. Historically, these documents were specific yet occasionally ambiguous. They allowed a certain flexibility in practice, especially when social or political circumstances demanded discretion. Over time, certain exceptions had been tolerated. Royals who stepped back from active duty, yet retained their titles, were quietly allowed to maintain them. The expectation of service, while implied, was often unenforced. Tradition had softened the edges, but that very flexibility became the opening Kate would exploit. During her internal review of modernization, she discovered an almost overlooked clause. Royal titles were contingent upon active service to the crown. That language, seemingly benign and administrative, was a ticking time bomb for anyone not actively participating in the day-to-day responsibilities of the monarchy. And in Meghan's case, the implication was immediate and dramatic. Her position was paradoxical. Meghan was still royal by marriage, still addressed by formal titles and public ceremonies, still photographed in royal settings, and still treated with the courtesy reserved for senior members of the firm. Yet her formal duties, the active engagements, the official representation, the visible contribution to the monarchy's institutional work, were largely absent. In the eyes of the clause Kate discovered, this absence was not a mere oversight. It was grounds for reevaluation. Kate didn't stumble upon this loophole by accident. Weeks of methodical review, consultations with palace lawyers, historical analysts, and longtime courtiers led her to the realization that the monarchy had quietly allowed a contradiction to persist, and that contradiction could now be corrected under the guise of modernization. This was crucial. For decades, Non-working royals had sometimes retained privileges that were technically conditional. Enforcement was rare because doing so required courage, strategy, and an understanding of political optics. Kate possessed all three. The timing was significant. The monarchy was under scrutiny. Public trust was fragile. Social commentary, media scrutiny, and even political pressure were pushing for transparency and modernization. By framing enforcement of the rule as part of a broader modernization effort, Kate could implement it in a way that appeared progressive rather than punitive. To the public, it was reform. To Meghan, it would feel sudden, unavoidable, and personal. Internal discussions were tense. Advisors debated the risks, the backlash, the international media scrutiny, the potential damage to the monarchy's image, and the inevitable response from Meghan's camp. Yet Kate remained focused. She understood the nuances of authority. She knew that asserting this loophole required not just procedural correctness, but impeccable framing, timing, and presentation. It was a chess move, one that required foresight, subtlety, and precision. The implications extended beyond Meghan. Enforcing the active service requirement meant that other royals could also be affected in the future. The principle was systemic. The monarchy could no longer allow exceptions without scrutiny. Kate's discovery, therefore, was not just a tactical strike. It was an institutional recalibration. By acting decisively, she could reinforce the hierarchy, clarify expectations, and modernize the rules governing royal conduct. But let's return to Meghan for a moment. For years, her team had assumed that her title was untouchable, a symbolic shield she could wield in media narratives, public appearances, and contractual negotiations. No one expected a formal, legal argument to threaten it. And yet, that is exactly what Kate found, an unassailable rationale embedded in centuries of precedent. It was airtight, defensible, and, crucially, enforceable. The palace's response was measured but deliberate. Kate presented the findings to William and a small group of senior advisors. The atmosphere was a mixture of disbelief and cautious excitement. They understood immediately the gravity of what had been uncovered, a legitimate, procedural basis for re-evaluating Meghan's title. This wasn't rumor, gossip, or public speculation. It was the law, clarified, codified, and ready to be enforced. Discussion then shifted to strategy. How should this loophole be applied? How could it be framed in a way that advanced modernization rather than personal vendetta? What language would ensure public understanding without igniting unnecessary controversy? Kate led the discussions with an exacting precision. Every word, every sentence, every line of communication was scrutinized. It was not enough to be legally correct. The presentation had to resonate with history, public perception, and institutional integrity. Simultaneously, the palace recognized that enforcement would trigger immediate reactions. Meghan's PR machinery was global, sophisticated, and fast. They anticipated a flurry of statements, social media posts, interviews, and public commentary. Yet Kate and her advisors calculated that the legal clarity of the loophole would neutralize many counterarguments. The question of fairness, once abstract, was now firmly grounded in precedent. And the optics, framed as modernization, could mitigate perception of personal targeting. As planning continued, tension inside the firm mounted. Every meeting, every consultation, and every draft of the proposed communication revealed how delicate the situation truly was. They understood the duality. Meghan's title was at risk, yet the monarchy's reputation was equally at stake. A misstep could escalate from procedural enforcement to international scandal. The challenge was not whether they could act, but how they could act decisively while preserving institutional credibility. Kate's focus was unwavering. She knew that timing, clarity, and framing were paramount. The moment for action had to coincide with a larger narrative about modernization, public accountability, and reform. And when executed correctly, the move would accomplish several objectives simultaneously. Enforce a long-standing rule, clarify expectations for all royals, and consolidate Kate's authority as a leader capable of guiding the monarchy into the modern era. By the time the plan was ready, the stakes could not have been higher. Meghan's title was no longer a mere formality. It was the center of a storm that bridged centuries of tradition, contemporary public expectations, and intense personal dynamics. And the palace, armed with Kate's discovery of the loophole, was prepared to act. Cliffhanger. But enforcing the rule wouldn't just affect Meghan. Once the mechanism was activated, it would trigger consequences that no one inside the palace fully anticipated, ripple effects across titles, relationships, and even the global perception of the monarchy. And the first shockwaves were about to hit. Behind closed doors, Kate presented the findings, and William's reaction changed the entire conversation. That statement might sound simple, but it masks the tension, calculation, and high stakes of a private meeting that would ultimately reshape the monarchy's approach to titles, duties, and hierarchy. This was not a casual discussion over tea. This was a strategic council between two of the most consequential figures in the royal family, the kind of meeting where history can pivot in a single exchange. The setting was Adelaide Cottage, a seemingly serene backdrop for what would become one of the most consequential decisions in recent royal history. Outside, the world saw calm gardens, a quiet home, and the familiar image of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge standing in harmony. Inside, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation. Advisors and aides had briefed Kate meticulously. She had carefully compiled legal precedents, historical examples, and a full dossier on the implications of the active service loophole. Every page, every note, every citation was ready. She was prepared to present the case with clarity, precision, and unflinching logic. William listened, not just as a husband, but as the future king, responsible for ensuring the stability and credibility of the monarchy. He understood the delicacy of the moment. Any misstep could trigger public outrage, media chaos, or internal dissent. Yet he also understood the strategic opportunity to formalize rules, assert authority, and reinforce the credibility of the institution. As Kate laid out her findings, he absorbed every detail: the legal foundation, the historical precedent, the public perception, the potential backlash. The conversation began with a question, deceptively simple. What are the implications if we enforce this rule now? Kate's answer was deliberate. She outlined how the loophole could be applied to Meghan's case without appearing vindictive, framing it instead as a modernization effort aligned with transparency, accountability, and equity. She emphasized that the action was not personal, it was procedural. It was about principle, precedent, and the future of the monarchy. William's reaction was thoughtful, measured, but internally decisive. He asked probing questions. How will the public perceive this? Could it be framed as progressive rather than punitive? How might Meghan's team react? What are the legal ramifications? Each question was answered with precision, but the discussion wasn't just about logistics. It was about ethics, optics, and legacy. Emotion ran under the surface, however. Kate and William both understood the human element. Meghan was not just a public figure. She was a member of the family by marriage. Any action against her title would have emotional, relational, and familial consequences. They discussed the potential fallout extensively, weighing the need for reform against the personal and public implications. Kate's calm and reasoned approach reassured William, yet the gravity of the decision weighed heavily on both. At one point, William leaned back, fingers steepled, and said quietly, "This will change everything." The words hung in the air, not as a warning, but as a recognition of reality. Every enforcement of this rule would reverberate across the monarchy, public opinion, and international media. It was not just a correction of a technicality. It was a signal that the monarchy was willing to assert its authority, modernize its practices, and enforce standards consistently. Kate nodded. She had anticipated this moment, and she had anticipated the need for William's support. Their partnership was critical. Alone, Kate's findings were influential. With William's backing, they became decisive. Their collaboration ensured that the decision could be defended both internally and externally. The loophole was not just a procedural anomaly. It was a strategic instrument that, when wielded carefully, could achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. The discussion then moved to timing. When should the announcement be made? How should it be framed to maximize clarity and minimize misinterpretation? What language would signal fairness, modernization, and institutional integrity? Kate proposed a carefully constructed communication plan that would present the change as a natural evolution of monarchy, emphasizing duty, service, and transparency. Every word was scrutinized, every nuance considered. The framing was crucial. It had to appear inevitable, reasoned, and principled, not reactionary or personal. William raised concerns about Meghan's potential response. She will fight this, he said. The PR machine, the media, the public, it will all be magnified. Kate agreed, but emphasized the defensibility of the loophole. We are not inventing rules, she explained. We are enforcing existing standards consistently. It is fair, it is justified, and it is long overdue. The emotional tension in the room was palpable. Both understood that this was more than a legal or procedural decision. It was a moment that would test loyalty, judgment, and relationships. It was a test of leadership for Kate, for William, and for the monarchy itself. The discussion circled repeatedly around consequences, personal, institutional, and public. How would Harry respond? What would Meghan say? How would the media spin this? And yet, beneath all of these concerns, there was clarity. The loophole existed, it was enforceable, and the moment for action had arrived. Kate's demeanor remained composed, but internally, she understood the enormity of what she was proposing. This was not simply a bureaucratic correction. It was a power move, carefully calibrated, grounded in principle, and backed by law. It would redefine expectations for royal service, assert institutional authority, and, inevitably, challenge Meghan's standing. William finally spoke. If we do this, it must be framed correctly. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. It has to be about modernization, duty, and fairness. Kate nodded. Agreed. The wording, the timing, and the framing, everything must align. We cannot afford missteps. The strategic discussion continued, covering every possible scenario. They debated the messaging, the timing of the public announcement, potential leaks, and the ways in which Meghan's team might respond. They even considered contingencies for international reactions and media framing. Every angle was scrutinized, every possibility evaluated. By the end of the meeting, the path forward was clear. The loophole would be applied, the enforcement would be framed as modernization, and the monarchy would take a decisive step toward defining what it truly means to hold a royal title. Yet, even with all this planning, both Kate and William recognized one uncomfortable truth. The human element could never be fully controlled. Meghan's reaction, Harry's response, public perception, and media amplification could all produce outcomes that exceeded their calculations. The stakes were high, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the walls of Adelaide Cottage. As the meeting concluded, Kate and William understood that they had reached a pivotal moment in the monarchy's modern history. The loophole had been identified. The enforcement plan had been approved. The framing had been agreed upon. All that remained was execution. Cliffhanger. And that's when they realized who would fight back the hardest. Not a distant critic, not the press, but someone intimately connected, someone who would challenge the decision with every tool at their disposal. The real confrontation, as the palace would soon discover, was only just beginning. Not everyone wanted Kate to modernize the monarchy so aggressively. That phrase captures the tension, conflict, and internal debate that raged behind the polished doors of Buckingham Palace before the announcement went public. While Kate and William had identified the loophole and crafted the legal and procedural foundation for enforcing it, the palace was not a monolithic institution. It was a complex ecosystem of tradition, hierarchy, and competing loyalties, and within that ecosystem, resistance simmered. Senior courtiers immediately raised concerns when the plan was first proposed. Some feared the public reaction. How would people in the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth, and the global media interpret the enforcement of a centuries-old rule against a member of the family who had become a global celebrity? Would it appear fair, or would it look vindictive? Could it potentially damage the monarchy's reputation in ways that even careful framing could not prevent? These were not trivial considerations. Royal legitimacy is fragile, built upon public trust and the perception of fairness. One misstep, one miscalculated announcement, and decades of goodwill could be undermined. Advisors debated the wisdom of moving forward. Some suggested a softer approach, arguing that modernization could be implemented incrementally rather than through a high-profile enforcement of a loophole. Others warned that acting too aggressively could be perceived as punitive, especially given Meghan's global visibility and media-savvy public persona. The fear was clear. This was no longer simply an internal palace matter. It was a story destined to capture international headlines, ignite social media firestorms, and dominate public discourse. The tension inside the palace grew more complex as factions emerged. Traditionalists, loyal to precedent and cautious about upsetting established norms, argued for restraint. They suggested that Meghan's title, while technically in question, could be left alone until circumstances demanded enforcement, or until she voluntarily abdicated her active role. These voices worried that an immediate and aggressive move would create unnecessary drama, painting the monarchy as vindictive and unsympathetic. On the other side were reformists, those who recognized the long-term benefits of a decisive action. They argued that ambiguity could no longer be tolerated. Leaving Meghan's title intact while she was not actively serving set a dangerous precedent. Other royals might assume that ceremonial or symbolic roles could be maintained indefinitely without accountability. They saw the loophole not as a weapon, but as a necessary tool to clarify expectations and uphold the integrity of the monarchy. Kate, however, was unwavering. She recognized the legal and ethical justification for enforcement. More than that, she understood the optics of consistency. To present a monarchy committed to fairness and accountability, exceptions could not be tolerated. She emphasized that the move was about principle, the principle that titles carry duties, and duties are not optional. Kate argued that framing the decision within modernization allowed the palace to enforce the rule without appearing punitive, personal, or reactionary. It was about clarifying what it truly meant to hold a royal title in the 21st century. Even with Kate's confidence, anxiety ran high. Advisors knew that Meghan's response would be swift and strategic. Her PR team, celebrity connections, and public visibility could generate unprecedented backlash. Some feared that enforcing the loophole could lead to a transatlantic confrontation, pitting the monarchy against the global media, social platforms, and a highly sympathetic public. It was a high-risk maneuver with no clear precedent. Yet Kate's determination won out. She understood that true modernization requires courage. If the monarchy wanted to redefine the roles, responsibilities, and expectations of its members, it could not shy away from conflict. Especially conflict that had been lying dormant for years. The loophole existed, it was enforceable, and leaving it unaddressed would have undermined the credibility of any subsequent reforms. The pushback wasn't limited to abstract debates or strategic arguments. Senior courtiers engaged in intense discussions, assessing possible consequences, drafting alternative proposals, and even recommending delaying the decision until public sentiment aligned more favorably. Some proposed minor concessions, such as partial recognition or honorary titles, but Kate rejected these compromises. She insisted that any deviation would weaken the precedent and send a message of inconsistency. Her stance was firm. The rule applied equally to all, and personal considerations could not override principle. Amid the internal debate, another layer of complexity emerged: the global audience. Meghan's visibility in the United States, her media presence, and her relationships with high-profile celebrities meant that any action against her would immediately draw attention. Advisors worried about how social media would amplify criticism, how the press would interpret motivations, and how the public might perceive fairness. This was not a contained royal issue. It was a global spectacle waiting to happen. Despite these fears, Kate remained composed. She approached the pushback with strategic patience, addressing concerns with logic, precedent, and ethical reasoning. She emphasized that the decision was procedural, legally grounded, and framed in alignment with modernization goals. Her calm, methodical approach helped assuage some of the palace's most vocal critics, yet unease lingered. For many inside, the move was bold, perhaps dangerously so, and the risks were undeniable. The debate reached its peak when a group of advisors warned that acting could provoke not just public backlash, but familial discord. They cautioned that Harry, Meghan's husband, would see the enforcement as a personal attack, potentially escalating tensions within the family and creating irreparable rifts. Kate acknowledged this risk, understanding that the emotional and relational consequences were significant. But she countered that institutional integrity could not be compromised by personal sensitivities. The monarchy, she argued, must act in accordance with rules, duty, and principle, even if it caused short-term discomfort or conflict. And then there was the final consideration: timing. Even Kate recognized that when and how the announcement was made could determine its success or failure. The language, the presentation, and the framing had to be impeccable. A poorly timed revelation could backfire, causing the public and media to view the move as vindictive rather than principled. Kate insisted that the announcement coincide with broader modernization messaging, highlighting accountability, service, and duty, themes that resonated with both the public and the institution's long-term goals. Even with these measures, however, the palace knew the first reactions would be uncontrollable. Social media would explode. News outlets would dissect every word. Commentary would range from praise for fairness to accusations of cruelty. And Meghan's response, carefully crafted, amplified by her global platform, was expected to be immediate, strategic, and assertive. The pushback, in other words, was only beginning. Yet Kate persisted. She understood that the enforcement of the loophole was about more than one individual. It was about the monarchy's future. It was about defining expectations for all royals, clarifying the relationship between privilege and responsibility, and demonstrating that modernization required consistency, courage, and action. By the time the palace agreed to move forward, the internal debate had crystallized. Pushback had been considered, addressed, and ultimately outweighed by principle. The loophole would be enforced. The timing and framing would emphasize modernization. And the message was clear. Active service was non-negotiable, and titles were contingent upon participation. Cliffhanger. But the biggest pushback didn't come from the palace. It came from California. Across the Atlantic, Meghan Markle's team had already sensed movement, and their response would ignite a battle that neither the monarchy nor the public was fully prepared for. The real confrontation was about to unfold in real time. What if the palace wasn't just moving quietly behind the scenes, but actively preparing to enforce a rule that could strip Meghan of her royal title? That was the question circulating inside Meghan Markle's team long before the announcement went public. The moment the word active service began circulating as the new benchmark for royal titles, Meghan's advisors knew they were entering a high-stakes game. One that could define her identity, her public image, and her influence in ways far beyond the palace walls. The story begins in the days leading up to the announcement. Meghan's team, a small but highly coordinated network of PR strategists, legal experts, and personal advisors, had grown increasingly anxious. Subtle signals were emerging. Palace communications had shifted, legal documents were being reviewed with unusual intensity, and there was a heightened buzz in the corridors of royal correspondents who had their ear to insider channels. These signs were subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but to a seasoned PR operation, they screamed urgency. The first discussions among Meghan's team were cautious. They acknowledged the rumors, but hoped they were merely speculative. Yet as internal briefings continued, the evidence became undeniable. The palace was considering formal enforcement of the active service clause. Meghan's title, once assumed to be secure by virtue of marriage and public perception, was now in jeopardy. The team realized they needed to act, but how do you defend against a centuries-old precedent embedded in royal law? Every member of her team understood the stakes. Titles are not just ceremonial. They are leverage, legitimacy, and access. For Meghan, retaining her title meant maintaining her position as a recognized member of the firm, with all the influence, visibility, and credibility that entailed. Losing it would not merely be symbolic. It would redefine her relationship with the monarchy, alter her public perception, and complicate ongoing ventures, from charitable work to media projects tied to her royal identity. The team immediately began assessing the palace's potential moves. They studied legal precedents, historical cases of title revocation, and the nuances of letters patent that defined royal hierarchy. They reached out to consultants familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy. Every angle was considered: timing, framing, precedent, and potential loopholes. The realization was chilling. The loophole Kate had discovered was airtight. It was enforceable, and with William and Kate aligned on strategy, the palace's position was unassailable. Meanwhile, Meghan herself was growing increasingly anxious. Reports filtered through. The palace had convened senior advisors, legal counsel had been consulted, and the modernization plan, which had once seemed abstract, was now about to become concrete. Her own sense of control, already diminished by stepping back from working royal duties, seemed to slip further. Questions raced through her mind. Could they really do this? How fast could they act? And what would be the public reaction?